All right, finally, it gives people you're talking to something to think about. So by asking questions, and we saw this in the illustration with Jesus, it forces people to think out their beliefs. It might even get them to consider something they never thought about before. Now, sometimes you hear the expression, as Christians, we want to plant seeds. There's another expression that Greg Koukl uses, which is put stones in shoes. And I like that expression because his idea is that every conversation isn't going to end up being a gospel presentation, right? Now our goal should always be to bring the person to Christ, right? To share the gospel, to disciple them and help them grow in their faith. Even when they're a skeptic, we want to help disciple them and grow them in their faith. But we just got to face the reality. Every conversation isn't going to end up as a gospel presentation. So what Greg Koukl tries to do in every conversation is what he calls putting a stone in someone's shoe. And basically the idea is, think about it, when you have a stone in your shoe, can you ignore it, right? It becomes a very irritating thing, right? So you might be able to walk away, but you want something in there that the person's having a hard time to ignoring. So that's the ultimate goal if you know you're not going to get a chance to get into a deeper conversation about the gospel. So asking questions gives something to think about. And the tactical question is, have you ever considered? So let me give you an example from when I was teaching full-time. One of our art teachers, and just to point out, I had a very good relationship with her already. So this is the result of having a rapport with her already. I considered her a friend. We'd often have lunch together and get into some great conversations. And she was very kind of free-spirited type, very into like new agey sort of things and things like that. And honestly, when I was an atheist I think I would have been in high school, I worked at a glorious job at Kmart. And you younger folk probably don't even know what a Kmart is anymore, but it's kind of like Walmart. And I worked in the stockroom, and I worked with this guy named Bob. And Bob was a Christian, and he was very clear to me about the gospel. He was very clear that if I didn't follow Jesus Christ, I would go to hell. And honestly, I wasn't offended by that at all. I knew he sincerely believed it. And again, we had a rapport. So me on the other side, this time as the atheist, I wasn't offended by him telling me that because we already had a friendship and a rapport, and I knew he cared about me. But he did put a stone in my shoe one day. He brought up a tuning argument. And he didn't go into a lot of detail, but essentially he just said, there's scientists who say that the probability of life on Earth is so astronomical that there had to be an intelligent designer behind it. And that's all he said to me, and that honestly put a stone in my shoe. That stayed with me for years. Now jump ahead, to my 30s, my early 30s, when I came to Christ. I find out once I start studying apologetics, there's something called the fine-tuning argument that essentially is what Bob was talking about. So I'm having this conversation with the art teacher. I'm a brand new Christian. I'm maybe just a Christian, maybe 2 or 3 years at this point, in the lounge, and we start talking about God and whether God, existed or not. And I basically said the same exact thing Bob said. I said, well, there's scientists who say it's so improbable that we're here, that there has to be an intelligent designer behind creation. So she said, well, maybe we're created by aliens, which you actually hear quite a bit when you give people those sort of arguments. So I paused for a second and I thought about it, and I thought, okay, what's the best way to address this? And remember I said earlier, when you don't know what to say, ask a question. So I was like, no, let me ask a question. And I wound up asking a pretty good question and putting a stone in her shoe. So I essentially said to her, well, if you're willing to consider maybe aliens created us, is it really that much harder to logically think that maybe, there's a possibility that we're created by God? And she actually conceded. She actually said, yeah, that's a really good point, Steve. And I saw that as a victory. I left it at that. I wasn't going to push the issue at that point. I saw it as a victory. I put a stone in her shoe. So that's just an example. So once again, the 3 useful questions. What do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? Have you ever considered? What do you mean by that? Just to give you some further samples, examples, and we're about to wrap up. Someone says to you, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. So what do you mean by that? You can say, interesting. Can you explain that to me? I hear a lot of people say that, but what do you mean by that? You could say, so am I. As a Christian, I consider myself spiritual, but not religious. What do you think the differences are? What do you mean by spiritual? What do you mean by religious? In what way are you spiritual? How do you live out your spirituality? How would you say your spirituality is different than mine as a Christian? Right? So these are all questions to get the conversation going. How did you come to that conclusion? Again, a very common thing you hear. The Bible's been changed over time. Now, 9 times out of 10, when someone says something like that, they're just repeating something they heard, right? So ask them, how did you come to that conclusion? What convinced you of that? Why do you say that? What's the evidence? Have you done a lot of research on the topic? Can you tell me where to go to get that information? And then sometimes I like to, if the person is pretty well read, and I like to ask them, have you ever read anything that argues the opposite? Are you familiar with the counter arguments? And then have you ever considered? So usually after using the first 2 questions to get a dialogue going, then you can plant a stone in their shoe. Someone might say, you can't believe in both science or God. And you might say something like, have you ever considered that many people do, including scientists? Have you ever considered that science exists because of the Christian worldview? Have you ever considered that the debate is actually a philosophical one? It's not a debate of God versus science. It's really a debate about worldviews and which one is valid. Are you aware that most of the founders of modern science saw their work as worship of God? So we use that question to put stones in shoes. So the 3 useful questions. And just to wrap up, and then I'm done. So why? Why is evangelism and apologetics important? It's an important part of living out our Christian faith. We're motivated for love of God and neighbor. Our goal is to not have a debate, but have a discussion. And how to do that, we use those useful tactical questions. And just remember, Jesus said, behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves, right? So we want to be wise, but also innocent.